first public cemetery in the country opened here in Leeds in 1845. Named the Leeds Burial Ground, it's now known as Beckett Street Cemetery. This typical Victorian graveyard demonstrates the attitudes of its time, and it was separated into Anglican and Dissenters sections. Each portion had its own gates, lodge, chapel and staff. What the Victorians wanted were pleasing landscaped grounds, safety from body snatchers, and the dignity of a permanent memorial. In 1871, Henry Park's memorial stone was inscribed thus:
"Be sure to lay me here," he said, "in that sweet, lovely spot, and strew with flowers my grassy bed, to prove I'm not forgot."
Sadly, ivy is not the sort of greenery it envisaged. The inscriptions on these stones offer stark contrast with those of the present age. The giving of factual information is now out of fashion, and indeed often forbidden by church authorities, but we deny the past at our peril. The Victorians were not afraid to show affection, and were proud of their birthplace and their trades, as many stones affirm. Many guided groups enjoy learning from these books of stone. The grand memorial to Sarah Kidney, wife of Thomas, takes the form of a chimney. This is a listed monument. A delightful stone to Joseph Smales shows books tossed untidily on the piano, as though he had just stopped playing. Many stones tell of fatalities, such as that of Christopher Burns, master of the Henrietta, a square-rigged little cargo boat known as a Humber keel. He was only 21 when he was drowned in the Ouse at Goole in 1845. Almost hidden under the attack of self-seeding ash and sycamore, the grave of Thomas Irvine and his son says,
"Firework makers died November the 5th, 1850.
One wonders what accident befell them. Fred Smith, aged 12, met a strange death. He was killed instantly when a Handley Page airliner performing for Cobham's Flying Circus in Middleton Park was sucked down by a current of air and landed directly upon him. In 1892, a fire on the railway at the Dark Arches cost brave fireman James Potter Schofield his life. His fireman's helmet was carried in his funeral procession. On many stones, a widow is referred to by that wonderful Victorian term, relict of, rather than wife. Few women of today would find this acceptable. A walk along these ancient paths touches our hearts and minds, whatever our age. An important grave in civic terms is that of Jabez Tunnicliffe, who founded the Band of Hope, a children's temperance movement. The draped urn over his tomb indicates that he was a nonconformist. At the other end of the scale is that of Jane Dawes, now lost under a sea of cranesbill. Inscribed,
"From the asylum, a fallen woman, only 15 years old."
Amongst the famous is George Leather, civil engineer, whose two magnificent bridges, Victoria Bridge, built in 1839, and Leeds Bridge, built in 1840, still span the River Aire. Also John Barron, prominent clothier, who, as Lord Mayor, purchased round a park for the city. The cross of sacrifice announces the presence of the war dead, and there is a touching sense of comradeship in the many military memorials which dot the cemetery. The memorial to Frederick Short of the 4th Hussars records 3 generations of a soldiering family. He was one of the 600 who fought in the misconceived but heroic charge of the Light Brigade. As for Sergeant William Notley, who was in engagements at Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman and Sebastopol, we can see him rise before our eyes with his soldier's ramrod bearing and his chest clinking with campaign medals. Here we can walk about this other world where the dream is freedom, but a waking man's perception. In 1914, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 750 of the 800-strong regiment of the Leeds Pals were killed. A whole community wiped out in a single day.
In Beckett Street, the bugle calls faint and far away.
The most unusual and the most moving memorials are the famous Guinea graves. These were communal graves with a simple headstone. Welcomed by those who were poor but not destitute, they paid 1 guinea to avoid the shame of a nameless grave. 1 stone served for the graves both east and west of it. Many of those buried here had lived in cramped houses, built back to back. After death, they were buried as they had lived, back to back. Despised as these graves were then, they now teach a valuable lesson in social history. This sanctuary is a green oasis. Sadly, perhaps because of its untended state, it attracts drug users and vagrants, which makes it a no-go area for the majority. A walk along these ancient paths touches our hearts and minds. In a very real sense, yesterday is within us. The desire to belong to both past and present goes very deep in human nature. Beckett Street Cemetery recreates for us the urban history of centuries past and the people who made the city what it is today. As long as it remains, they will not be forgotten.